So my talk is titled Beyond Copy Paste Agile, and we're going to explore these topics of creating focus, finding leverage, and building habits. I'll get to that in a minute. I'd like to first ask, for those of you who are in the audience and on the chat, there's a couple of points where I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, and I'd like you to either just to type in the chat, or if you just shout out on the side and someone can give me the answers from that side. But my question for you is, how many of you know where this is? Do you know where this wonderful part of the world happens to be?
New Zealand?
Someone says New Zealand. Manuel is saying on the chat, Cape Town, South Africa, and that is in fact the correct answer. So this is the place that I originally come from. Although I am living somewhere else right now, I originally started my journey down here. A little bit of a sales pitch for the country because it is a wonderful place. What you see is literally how the city looks. There's also wonderful wine. There's a lot of nature. There's beautiful beaches all around. If you have the opportunity to visit, I highly recommend it. But basically, I started my journey primarily in product management. Roughly, if you see where the harbor is, just behind there, there was a building there. I was working in telecoms, and my role was head of product in this telco, and we were doing a bunch of interesting things. Along the journey, I discovered a couple of folks who were working at a different company, and they invited me to come and leave this beautiful place and instead come and hang out in this place. Does anybody know where this city is? Manuel, you are going to be my question and answer person in the chat. I see there's a couple of hands in the audience. But yeah, you are correct. This is Stockholm, Sweden. So actually going on 10 years ago now, I met a couple of folks from Spotify and got the opportunity to come and join the company during the crazy growth period of the organization. When I joined, the company was around 700 people, and about just over 4.5 years later, when I left, we were about 5,000 people, which is a pretty insane story, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of that today. Before we get into that, I want to give you a little bit of I guess maybe a guiding story to think about. So the story goes that a kid is watching their parents making dinner. And as you can imagine, for those of you who have kids, you know that their favorite question is always to ask, why? Why do you do that? Why do you do this? Why does that happen? The kid notices that as the parents put their roast into the oven, they cut a piece off the top of the roast just as they slot it into the pan. The kid, of course, goes, well, why? Why do you do this? Parents look at each other. They realize they have no idea, no good answer. They say, well, we learned this from our parents. So a hop, skip, and a jump through the story, and basically the parents don't know. They end up talking to the grandparents. The grandparents, when asked this question, why do you cut a little bit of roast off the top before you put it in the oven? They immediately pack out laughing, and they say, well, my dears, when we got married, we actually didn't have so much money, and therefore our stove and thus our pan, the oven was really, really small. So the only way to fit the roast in the pan was actually to cut a piece off. The reason I like this story is because I think many, many times we do the same thing inside a company. We've passed an idea down through the generations, maybe from another company. You hear this people copying Spotify, copying OKRs from Google, something else from Facebook, and so on. But the challenge is that if we don't ask this question as the kid was doing of why do we do this? We run the risk of borrowing and copying practices that may have possibly made sense when you had a very small oven, but given that we are working in a totally different environment today, they make a lot less sense. So I think for me, what's important is that we want to start with first having a little bit of an understanding of our perception of our company and how it works. Now, why do I talk about perception? I think it's really important because very often what happens in an organization is that we describe, certainly in a recruitment scenario and in our marketing materials, the company gets described a little bit like this oven. It's quite new and shiny. It's got fancy bells and whistles, all of these kind of things. But the reality might, however, be a little bit different. And if our perception doesn't quite match reality, maybe we have this kind of a situation, right? We're not cooking with an electric stove, we're cooking with wood. And this can create a very, very different scenario and creates a very different jumping off point for us to consider what possible improvements would we need and how could we actually operate this at scale. Of course, for those of you who've worked in companies like this before, you get a great sales pitch during recruitment. Perhaps sometimes after you've spent a couple of months in the organization, you start to realize that maybe there were some gaps in their perception. And maybe you realize that actually it would have been better to describe the company a little bit more like this, yeah? We misunderstand things. And perhaps often, if you've done some sort of very chaotic deployment recently, you might even have encountered a situation where it's actually even a little bit more like this. So the question is, well, why is this perception important? Why do I spend so much time talking about this? Well, all three of these pictures on the screen here are totally viable ways of cooking, but the types of things that become possible and the capabilities that you have from each of these is quite vastly different. If you've ever tried to make a pizza in a microwave, you understand exactly what I'm talking about. It's not necessarily the best fit. And so what I want to emphasize here is that the very first step of adopting any kind of new principles, practices, frameworks, or tools is first to understand actually how does the organization currently function? Because our perception of where we're at right now will vastly change the possibilities and the capabilities that we have to work with. So over the next roughly 40 minutes or so, I want to explore with you this question of how do we move beyond copy-paste agile so that we're not just slicing a piece off the top of our roast when we're copying Spotify's model or borrowing OKRs from Google. We're actually solving a problem that we actually have in our organization. And I've got two different ways that I'm going to look at this. To give you a little bit of kind of a spoiler alert, my main thesis behind this, or the main point that I want to make, is that I think in order to do this effectively, what we need to do as an organization is work on these three steps. Firstly, we need to create focus so that we can actually deliver the things that we are trying to change, as well as the products we're trying to build. Secondly, we should focus on finding leverage and improving how we pick what we do. And thirdly, we should build habits to sustain that momentum as we go. So I'm going to take you on a little bit of a tour through this, and we're going to look at this approach through looking at the organization through three different lenses. The first lens is systems. How does everything fit together? The second one is science. How do we validate and understand what actually works? And the final one, sapiens, which is the human beings and the wonderful diversity and amazing creativity and ideas that we all bring to the mix. So let's jump into number one. The first one is to have a look at systems. And for me, this is about creating focus and using the interactions between all of the flight levels in your organization. Now, I'm wondering how many of you have experienced this situation. You're maybe working on multiple teams. You could be a coach or a leader in a space, charging from one team to the other to handle all of the dependencies that happen between the teams. The other thing that you may have perhaps experienced is something a little bit like this. I've been posting about this on LinkedIn quite a bit recently.
Sorry to interrupt.
I don't actually have a way. I don't have a way to turn my microphone up any further, unfortunately.
Okay.
I can swap to the other microphone if that helps.
Yeah, let's try that, please.
Cool. Do you hear me now?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay, cool.
Thank you.
Excellent. Cool. So the other thing, as I say, that you might find is that your company is in a habit of doing kind of consistent reorganizations. Every couple of weeks or every couple of months, you have some new idea. I've often seen it that somewhere between 6 and 12 months is usually... Okay. Seems the sound is different in the room and different on Zoom, but at least the people on Zoom can still hear me, so that's good. Cool. So basically the challenge here, as I say, is that we're dealing with this constant cycle of reorganization, and we're sort of in this repetitive, let's restructure and change the organization. So, you know, maybe today we're going from centralized design teams, maybe now we're moving to decentralized design teams, and so we run into some challenges as a result. Part of the challenge that I think about here is that you've probably all seen this picture most organizations are working in a situation where we have so many different things on the go that it's actually very hard to understand what the most important thing is. So essentially what we're doing as leaders is we're looking at this picture and we're saying, hey, there's actually we're trying to focus on being more efficient. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at these gaps between the cars and say, let's focus on trying to put some additional cars onto this highway. The challenge is, as you know, if you've ever been in a traffic jam, putting more cars onto an already crammed highway definitely does not improve the situation. You almost always end up getting home significantly later. And that's exactly what we see with the work. So let's have a little bit of a look at why this is. So if you imagine your company as a keyboard and the customer comes to you and says, our wish is that you are going to write us a love letter. Often what we've done is we've organized our teams as if they have one row on the keyboard, right? And so what happens is as we do this, we grow and we specialize our teams even further, and we actually give each team a single key on the keyboard. And so now what's happening is the team that owns the A key is trying to mash this A key as fast as possible. They're pushing it super, super quickly. Smoke is coming out the keyboard. It's almost wearing out. But at the end of the day, from the customer perspective, we're not actually getting letters delivered. The challenge here, of course, is that because we don't need each team to be working as fast as possible, what we actually need is to have the right team pushing the right key at the right time. So what this actually becomes about is about the feedback loops and the interactions between the teams. And I think that what we need to be focusing on here is actually having some consistent dose of this every breakfast, lunch, and dinner within our organization. Don Reinertsen has a wonderful quote that he uses to capture this concept, where he says that decentralizing decision-making and control requires both decentralizing the authority to make decisions, but also the information to make decisions correctly. Now, part of what I find interesting with this is that very often what we've done is we've given each of these teams their key to push. We've asked them to go as fast as possible, but we haven't connected them to the other teams in the organization. So they don't know which letter would be most effective to push, or if maybe they should be helping out another team in order to complete one of the letters. My first proposal for you is to focus on this idea of going beyond the team level. I think we need to zoom out and focus on the interactions between the teams instead of trying to optimize for performance within each and every single one of the teams. That's not to say that high-performing teams are totally pointless, simply to say that if you don't also focus on the interactions between the teams, you may get a lot of A keys being pressed, but not necessarily a lot of improvement at the product and performance level that you actually care about. Another way to look at this is if you think about a typical team, often what happens is that we're focusing on a piece of the delivery, and what we're trying to do is get the work into done. So from the team's perspective, we could say, okay, cool, we are done. The work has arrived in the done column. But the reality is that if we ask the question, well, what actually happens after it lands in done? And usually we find that there might be something like we're waiting for some sort of integration, or maybe even some acceptance, and perhaps even some sort of release process that is happening beyond the finishing of creating the software itself. And of course, we tend to do this on a fairly infrequent basis. We maybe don't release as often as we complete our sprints. The good news, however, is once it lands in done, it is at least done. But the reality is that if we ask some questions going the other way up the board, of course, we find out that this is actually only the software development backlog. And in front of that, we have something like a product backlog and some analysis. And if we zoom out a little bit further, we find that there is some triage, some approvals, some steering committees, a lot of decision-making. And as you can see here, also quite a lot of waiting. Once we zoom out and we look at this entire flow, and once again, you can see, of course, that we're not doing these things on the same frequency as we might be doing the actual software development. I start to wonder, well, what is the point in being agile in this step? We can be as agile as we want over there, but at the end of the day, we are still spending a hell of a lot of time actually waiting for something to get done. So the issue for me here is that because we can't yet see this full flow, what we're often doing in the organization is we're optimizing both for the A key to be pushed as fast as possible, but we're also doing this. We're focusing only on the development step of our end-to-end flow. We're not actually focusing on how the work gets all the way from idea to creating some kind of value. So I said to you at the beginning, why is perception important? Well, I think part of what we need to do is we need to visualize what's actually happening in our organizations so that we can see where would we find the most impact from improving. And I would argue that in almost every organization, it's not typing faster when we create the software. It's actually far more upstream on the left-hand side here, or possibly downstream on the right-hand side here. As we said already, the key here is to focus on the interactions between the teams and try to get the work flowing. So the step that I like here is to do this visualization. Visualize the full end-to-end flow and focus on getting things moving all the way from vision to value or from concept to cash, not just on optimizing the performance of any one single team. Now, you might be in a company where very often you say, but there's still space, or maybe you've heard this version of like, well, we should have capacity to deliver all the things. We've hired hundreds of thousands of people. To me, the challenge here is that what we're doing is we're basically back at this situation with the highway. We're trying to push more cars onto an already busy highway. So I want to share with you probably one of the most impactful things that I learned in my time at Spotify, and that is this. This is one of the teams, or one of the tribes at least, that I worked with. We built this visualization. For those of you familiar with flight levels terminology, this is a flight level 2 system. I'll touch on it in a minute and give some more context for those of you who are not yet familiar. But basically what we've got here on the far right-hand side is a bunch of green post-it notes called the current bets. These are the company's top 6 things that we are focusing on for the entire company, and they are in order. There is a single number 1, a single number 2, a single number 3, and a single number 4. What this enables us to do is be able to say between the teams that are busy pushing the A key, the B key, and the C key, which letter should we actually write first? So what that means is that the number 1 bet for the company essentially gets a little bit of a fast track through the organization. The idea is if I need your help and I'm working on number 1, you should stop what you're doing and help me with number 1. Similarly, if you come to me and say, hey, Cliff, can you help me out on this thing? I'm busy doing number 17 over here. I would probably say to you, sorry, dude, I'm busy with number 1 for the company. So can you come back a little bit later? Or here's some documentation about the stuff that I wrote earlier. Or can you chat to that other team because they also know how to support it? Basically, what we're trying to do is create a situation where we do not let our number 3 item block our number 1. This is what helps us to avoid creating these traffic jams. And once we can start to do this inside a company, when we have a clear sequence of how we are going to spend our energy, we start to be able to actually get things done. For some of you, you may have seen this picture before, but in essence, this is kind of the core concept behind flight levels. And what we try to do here is think about the organization at 3 different levels of abstraction, right? You've got right down in the detail, the operational work, the things that happen on the ground. If you fly really high at the top, you start to see quite wide, but you lose some of the detail. This is where you see the strategy and the broad view of the organization. And in the middle, you have the most commonly missing piece of many companies, flight level 2 or the coordination system. The place where we make the decision to decide, should team 1 work on this thing or that thing? Which of the letters should we essentially be writing? Now, there's a lot more that I could say about flight levels, but we have limited time and I want to take you through a couple of other things as well. But the one most important thing that I want to point out here is that this is not hierarchy in the sense of like the CEO only works on the strategy and the software developers only work on operational work. In a healthy and productive organization, anybody can have access and visibility and influence across all of the levels. You might have different authorities and you might have different reporting lines, hierarchies, and so on. But in order to build a good strategy, I find that it's usually helpful to take into account some of the implications from a software team that are working on that in the detail. And maybe you have some folks from marketing, from business, from product development, and so on. And so this is about creating the levels where we come together to interact about the level of the problem or the scope of the thing that we are doing, not necessarily about the level in the hierarchy and who gets paid the most, if that makes sense. So yeah, this is flight levels in a nutshell. And I think basically the things that I'm talking about over the course of this talk, the idea of creating focus, finding leverage, and building habits, we actually want to do this at all three levels. My personal focus is mostly on working at these top two levels because I find there's already quite a lot of focus and a lot of improvement already happening at level 1. And if we rather focus on level 2 and 3, we start to see the whole company improving instead of just the teams. So to recap this first point on systems, I said here that what we should do is try to go beyond the team level to visualize the end-to-end flows. And secondly, we should create an environment where we do not let number 3 block number 1, and so we can avoid creating the traffic jams. If you'd like to read more about these 3 topics, or about this topic, there's 3 books that I can recommend. Thinking in Systems by Donella Meadows. This is essentially a textbook on understanding systems in general. Highly, highly recommend this book for those of you who have not yet read it. It explores things from ecology to science to social systems to company environments. Really, really quite a profoundly impactful book. In the middle, I think many of you are probably familiar with Klaus Leopold and his book, Rethinking Agile. This is a highly recommended book as well. It talks a lot more about flight levels in detail and the stories of how you could use it in your organization. And finally, we have Escaping the Build Trap by Melissa Perry, who some of you may know as well. She's written this wonderful book about how to get out of this space where we're constantly just trying to do more. And basically, how do we create effective product management that creates real value? So this is the topic of systems. Let's have a look at the next one. The second topic is science, or finding leverage through observation and experimentation. So I showed you a board earlier where we were looking at a team situation. And we can kind of ask this question, well, what happens when something is done? And let's assume that this is done from the team perspective. I usually ask this question when I start working with any team or with any company. What was the result of your last delivery? And usually what I find is the answer to this question is some variation of we don't know or we don't know yet. The challenge is that in many organizations, that we don't know turns into we never actually know. A lot of teams, and I'm sure some of you have experienced this, we are in the business, as Melissa Perry calls it, of being stuck in the build trap. So we're just delivering, shipping things, throwing it out there, but we actually don't know what happened. The best case scenario in many cases is that we might know what the output was. We can see the software that we have delivered, but very rare that we actually know the outcome of what we've delivered. The risk, of course, is that we can end up a little bit in this situation where what we've done is we've developed all of the side effects, but we haven't actually spent any time on developing the cure. I've seen this so many times with agile transformation and change work, where we've changed all of the things. Everyone is now squadified and scrumified and whatever else ified. But at the end of the day, the company is still not delivering faster. And of course, we have to ask the question of why. So as I said, very rarely do we actually know the outcome of what we've delivered. The challenge, I think, is that in a very large part, what we tend to do in our organizations is we tend to do a lot of very weird extrapolation. And if you've seen this comic before, I love XKCD. They have so many great comics. Of course, this kind of extrapolation makes absolutely no sense, right? We look at a single data point and we say, well, that happened. Therefore, the next time we do it, it's going to be magic and ponies out the other side. Now, you might be wondering, well, why does this happen? Jonathan Haidt explores this in his wonderful book, The Righteous Mind, where he says that human beings, we think of our mind as being we think of ourselves as being very rational. But in reality, we're actually much more of a story processor than we are a logic processor. And instead of kind of doing this approach that we think of, where we look at the data, we come to some kind of rational conclusion, and then we make a decision, he says that we actually do it the opposite way around. We use our intuition to make a decision, and we use our rational reasoning capability to justify the decision that we've made. Now, this is backed up by a lot of research in neuroscience and how human beings actually work. And the challenge with this is that we need to somehow overcome this somewhat if we want to try to do a better job in our organizations. Another piece of this is, as Annie Duke explores in the wonderful book Thinking in Bets, is that we do what she calls resulting. What this means is that we tend to judge whether or not a decision was a good idea based on whether or not it achieved an outcome that we wanted. So quite simply, if I play poker, as Annie Duke does, if I win the hand, therefore I must be good at poker, and if I lost the hand, I must be bad at poker. The reality, however, is that very often we ignore the effects of luck, chance, and other systemic effects in the broader organization. And so we end up with these kind of situations where we're justifying, well, it worked for Spotify or for Google, therefore it should work for us. So what I want to suggest if we talk about how do we approach this is that what we need to start doing is writing down our hypotheses before we start specifically. So essentially, in order to do this, what we want to be able to do is say something like, if we had this today, what would the benefit be, right? If we changed all of our teams to be called squads, what would the difference be? And if you come up with a good answer that still makes sense to you and you think that it makes sense to take that action right now, then go for it. But if you sit and you look at that and you go, that's just renaming something that we already have, I'm not sure that that's going to make a significant impact. Perhaps we consider doing something instead. You could also ask this question of what assumptions would need to be true in order for this to work? What would need to actually happen in reality, right? So the first step of this is to quantify your hypothesis and reflect as you go, specifically writing the hypothesis beforehand so that you can reflect on it later on and see, because the difference between what you thought would happen and what actually happened, this is the opportunity for learning. Now, in many cases, companies just try to throw more people at their work. And the challenge that I have with this is that I think that it's not necessarily very effective. I want to put it to you that what you work on matters far more than how hard you work. The specific things that you choose to spend your energy on have a far bigger impact on the results that you achieve than how much time you spend doing things. The key for me here is that what we want to do is we want to start to now look for leverage. Now that we can focus in the organization, we are trying to look for the key points of leverage. Now, what do I mean by leverage? Now, leverage for me is if you think of a bicycle in contrast to walking, right? The amount of energy that it consumes to travel a certain amount of distance varies quite significantly, right? A bicycle is enormously more efficient based on energy consumption than walking, and it's actually even more efficient than a car. So what we're trying to look for is what are the things like a bicycle? What are the high leverage things that we could do that would give us some kind of boost or performance gain so that we can spend as little energy to get as much impact as possible? So I'm going to tell you a little story from my time at Spotify, which I call how we built a retrospective machine. For those of you who have worked as Agile folks or Agile coaches, Scrum Masters, something like this, you've probably had a request, hey, could you come and help me run this retrospective for my team? And we were getting this quite a lot at Spotify. We didn't have enough coaches to support every single team. And so what we decided to do instead was create a program to educate everybody on how to run retrospectives and then connect those newly educated folks with the teams that needed support. So what we did was we invited a bunch of folks and we said, who would like to learn to run retrospectives? And then we created a Slack channel after we'd run a quick facilitation guide. We created a Slack channel where anybody could show up and say, hey, I'd like to get a third-party person to come and help facilitate with my team's retrospective. And now what would happen is someone from another team who was maybe a product owner or a software developer or one of the engineering leads could then go and help out that team. The first few times they run it, one of the experienced coaches would maybe, depending on their comfort level, either run it for them as a demonstration, pair up with them and run it together, or perhaps just sit in the room and give them some feedback and guidance points as they go. or even just after the fact say, hey, let's have a quick discussion and see where you're at. This had two profound effects. Firstly, it freed up the coaches from being the retrospective ATM that we'd kind of become before. And it meant that what was happening is that the teams themselves were actually building these lateral links between the different teams. So Team A over here was facilitating workshops and retrospectives, at least for Team B, and then they would actually swap in many cases, and someone from the other team would connect and help them out. Now they start to understand a little bit about the team's context. They build a bit of a social relationship. They maybe even exchange some sort of things about their priorities and discussions. But this kind of thing, I think, provides a much higher leverage than taking the action of me as a coach, just showing up and delivering a retrospective for them. So I want to encourage you to think about these things. Find the leverage within your organization, both as leaders, agilists, and product developers. Figure out what it is that you're working on and where can you focus that would give you far more impact. Because as I already said, what you work on matters far more than how hard you work. So to recap this piece on science, two key points here. I want you to think carefully about quantifying your hypothesis before you start. Write them down, reflect, and learn from the outcomes that you achieve after you've delivered them. And secondly, use that to then inform your decisions as you look for leverage so that you can learn to work smart and not just hard. I mentioned a couple of books, and there's one additional here that I didn't already mention. The two I mentioned being Thinking in Bets on the left and The Righteous Mind on the right. In the middle is a wonderful book called Polarity Management. The subtext says, Identifying and Managing Unsolvable Problems. And it explores specifically, as the diagram starts to indicate, this oscillation that we find where we go from centralize everything to decentralize everything, or from left wing to right wing, or any of the other polarities that we tend to oscillate with in our companies and societies at large. This concept sounds interesting. It's probably one of the most interesting concepts I've discovered in recent years. I would highly recommend checking out all three of these books. Cool. So we've covered systems, we've covered science. The next up is to talk about sapiens. So we've all heard of this idea of the wonderful diversity of human beings, but I'm curious, maybe just by a show of hands from those of you in the room and on the chat, how many of you have heard this statement, people resist change? Yeah, looks like almost every hand in the room is up. Maybe you've also heard the slightly sort of stronger worded version of this, which is, and they probably won't work unless we tell them what to do. Now, I want to put it to you that if these things are actually true in your company, what you're essentially saying when you think this is that you have dead wood inside your organization. I want to put to you that if you have dead wood inside your company, there's only two ways that it got there. Either you hired the dead wood, or you hired live wood and you killed it. The point for me here is that what I want to put to you is that, firstly, if we're hiring dead wood, I would argue that there's a fairly simple way to do that. Stop hiring people who don't fit and suit your company's skill sets and needs. But of course, if you're doing the second one, which I actually think is the more common one, you're hiring live wood and then killing it, we need to explore a little bit about why that is, because I think that's the challenge. You've heard a lot of organizations talking about the Great Resignation and how Generation Z doesn't want to work and so on. Mostly, I think what we've done is we've hired people who are excited about something and we've sucked all of their motivation out of them. So why does this happen? Well, in large part, most of our metaphors for understanding organizations, they look like this. It's machine models. We think of people and organizational systems as interchangeable parts, right? The challenge is that I think that this metaphor is wrong in a couple of key ways. Most simply, if you've ever tried to swap one person for another person on a team, you've understood that those differences actually play a very large and significant role. I think that a better metaphor for thinking about organizational design is actually forestry and ecosystems, right? If you're trying to create a healthy forestry and ecosystem environment, You don't go and set quarterly OKRs and put motivational values posters on the wall and set some sort of performance target on an individual basis for each of the trees and shout at them if they don't achieve their growth targets, right? And yet this is what we do inside our companies very often. What do we do instead if we're trying to do this? Well, we plant at the right time, the right season of the year. We make sure that they have enough sunlight, but not too little, not too much. We make sure that we take care of watering, that there's nutrients in the water, that they are part of a broader ecosystem, because a bunch of trees together tends to create a much better forest than one just by itself. So basically what we need to do is we need to think of it more through the lens of ecology. Now, I think part of what prevents us from doing this is captured quite nicely with the next question I'm going to ask you. I'm curious, what do you think is going on here? Does anyone know what is happening here? Seems that Daniel on the chat has a sense of the answer. So I'll be honest, when I first saw this picture, I assumed that this was probably something like a wedding, maybe a graduation, somebody just got married, something like this. Because my mental model of what people who look like this, what they're probably doing, is not actually what they are doing. This is a bunch of scientists from the Indian Space Agency, the ISRO. They are celebrating a lander that has just been launched into Mars orbit. They have done this for the first time, or on the first attempt, and they did it for 1/10 of the cost that any organization or country has done it before or since. The scientific team that is celebrating here is the women who are largely responsible for this. It's a very diverse group of folks, but we don't tend not to think of folks, specifically older Indian women, as being sort of obviously a scientist. Now, one last thing about this is that they actually managed to put a lander in orbit around Mars for less money than Hollywood managed to make the movie The Martian. Now, the reason I'm telling you the story is because of the assumptions that we make about the capabilities of people based on how we see them look or our mental models of how they behave and the things that we have encountered in the past. I have a second example for you, and I want to ask the same question again. Can you tell me what is happening here?
Politics.
Politics. This is, in fact, politics. So what we're looking at here, this is a picture that actually appeared in an article. I think it was on the BBC originally. It was, believe it or not, this is Mike Pence, who was at the time the Vice President of the United States, here in the middle. This is Donald Trump's Council on Women's Rights. Now, putting aside your political beliefs and preferences, I just don't believe that there's any possible way that this group could make a good decision on this topic. Quite simply because, well, as you can see, there's no woman or anyone from anything other than an old white male background sitting in the room. And for me, this is the issue. Very often, our meeting rooms, our boardrooms, our senior leadership, our product management team, or whatever it is, looks exactly like this. So the challenge for me is that this kind of exclusion, it hides vital perspectives and information. And so what our job is here is that if we want to create an environment where things can be healthy and productive, and we embrace the wonderful variety that everyone brings to the table, we need to equalize and balance out the power dynamics and the representation in the room. So if you feel like this kid on the right-hand side when you are meeting a leader, or maybe if making a suggestion to your company feels like this, sometimes I've seen it even that a retrospective feels this way. Yeah. Certainly a restructure can feel this way. And most commonly, I think performance reviews can definitely feel this way. The point I'm trying to make here is that perspective matters, right? we value the wonderful ideas and the creativity of the very, very smart humans that we have hired into our company. And as we touched on earlier, perspective matters. And I can illustrate this very nicely with a single image for you. It's the same picture from different angles, right? So the point here is really what we want to do is we want to make sure that we are getting a variety of different perspectives into the mix so that we can more coherently understand what is actually happening in our organization. So I want to explore very briefly how and why this bias occurs. And we end up assuming that the Indian women are not scientists and that Donald Trump's council can make good decisions on women's rights. So many, many years ago, your ancestors and mine would have been roaming around on the plains of Africa, perhaps not too far away actually from where I grew up. And you saw something a little bit like this, maybe a large yellow item charging at you from behind a bush. And so if you start to assess the situation, you go, okay, well, it's yellow, it's moving quite fast, it's pretty sure it's coming in my direction, it looks fairly hungry. Problem is, if you take this approach and you think too long about it, instead of being surviving to continue on and produce children, you end up turning into lunch. So what do we develop instead? Those of us that survived, we developed what we call, as Daniel Kahneman calls, fast fit pattern matching rather than best fit pattern matching. It's the difference between, as he calls, system 1 and system 2. So instead of looking for the best fit, are we 100% certain that this is a lion? We just say it might be a lion and we run away. What this leads us to do is to make a lot of snap judgments and decisions and is the cause and the source of a lot of our bias. And so what I think we need to do is we need to first be able to acknowledge and recognize that we have these biases, but we also need to find ways to design around them. Now, the way that I think about this is that if diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is about choosing the music, right? We're not just trying to make sure that people are represented in the room, we want to make sure that they also are able to influence the environment in which they exist. What that means is that if you are all looking like this group, you need to invite some that are not. So if you're all managers, invite some people who are not. If you're all from product, if you're all software developers, if you're all men, if you're all women, if you're all from the same university, if you're all the same age, you're all the same seniority and hierarchy, we need to start to address this. This will help with affecting, firstly, the representation. The second example of this, and I'm going to slightly accelerate because I've just been told we have only a few minutes left, is that what we need to do is consider that very often in organizations, we have a very strong bias towards verbal communication over written communication. So what I like to do here is recommend that we start to consider using some tactics where instead of just focusing on, here's my idea, what do you think about it? We start to offer things like pre-reading. Give people some notes beforehand, let them think about it so that you get a much deeper, reasoned, and thoughtful response than simply a snap judgment in the context of your presentation. If we give people time to think and then follow up afterwards, we start to be able to see some of this stuff coming out, and we start to be able to get the effects of these huge, huge perspective shifts that are possible when we are working together as a group. I have 3 books that I can recommend here. Once again, Esther Derby's wonderful The 7 Rules for Positive Productive Change. Highly recommend this book for anyone who works in a change situation. Edgar Schein's Humble Inquiry for those of you who are trying to figure out how to be more helpful and ask better questions in your organization. And Liz Wiseman's the wonderful book, Multipliers. So, the first thing that we need to do in this step is we need to acknowledge the bias. We need to notice who's missing. And then the second piece of this is to intentionally design around our bias to create a more coherent understanding of the reality in which we work. And this brings me to this question. How do we move beyond this idea of copy-paste agile? We've talked about it from a number of different perspectives, from systems. How do we create focus through interactions and feedback loops across all of the flight levels? We looked at it through the lens of science, How do we find our leverage and shift from output focused to outcome focused so that we can quantify, reflect, and learn from what we're delivering? And finally, we looked at it through the lens of sapiens, building the habits of designing around our biases to leverage all these wonderful, diverse perspectives. This is how I think in organizations we can go beyond copy, paste, agile, and create focus, find leverage, and build habits. In closing, I want to put to you that very often what I hear is folks saying, well, coaching, teaching, training, investing in our people, this is very, very expensive. And very often what this sounds like to me is this sort of thing of, well, what if we invest in them and we leave? I think that a better way to think of this is, what if you don't and they stay? I want to invite you to continue the conversation and join me on LinkedIn. I'm fairly active sharing these ideas and others. I would love to meet as many of you as possible. Unfortunately, I'm not present in Graz today to be able to meet you in person, but perhaps we have the opportunity to connect. So I would love if you would reach out, say hi, tell me what you enjoyed about the talk. Let's have a conversation and discuss this a little bit further. I don't know if we have any time for actual questions now, because I think the closing of the conference is happening in a few minutes. But I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to what I've shared with you today, and I look forward to talking to you further on LinkedIn. Thanks so much for having me.